This week's Parsha is really in many ways the fundamental Parsha of the Torah. I mean, every Parsha is fundamental, but it certainly has the story that shaped all of Jewish history and all of Jewish existence, and is really the pivotal moment of history, what we call Ma'amad Har Sinai, the moment that the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai and received Aseres Hidabroot, the Ten Commandments and the Torah, which all happens here in Parshas Yitro. And what's interesting, though, is the structure of the Parsha, because the first half of the Parsha and the second half of the Parsha seem very disjointed. The first half of the Parsha talks about an event, which, even though it's certainly a very interesting event, it doesn't seem to fit into the portion of Matan Torah, and that's the event of Yisro coming to the desert. Now let's remember the history. When Moshe escaped Egypt, when Pari was trying to kill him because he killed an Egyptian who was beating a Jew, he ran away to a place called Midian. Over there he helped seven women who were at a well and being provoked and harassed, the Torah says, by the shepherds, and he saved them. And he helped them irrigate their flock. And then when they came back home, their father said, "Why didn't you bring him home to eat?" And of course they bring him, and he marries one of the daughters called Tzipora. Now what we don't know is, till this moment, is that Tzipora and his two children, their two children, Gershom and Eliezer, never made it back to Egypt, because the Torah does say that Moshe took a donkey, and he took his wife, and he took his children, and they were on the way back to Egypt. But in Parshas Yisro, we learned that at some point, he sent them away. So Rashi says that when Aaron saw them coming, he says, "Don't bring them to Egypt now, we have enough problems." So he sent them back home. So it's only in Parshas Yisro that the Torah begins that Yisro, who was the father-in-law of Moshe and the priest of Midian, decides to come visit his son-in-law. And of course he comes with his daughter Tzipora, Moshe's wife, and their two sons, the two babies, Gershom and Eliezer, who were born in Midian. And that's how the story begins. Vayishma Yisro, Yisro heard everything that happened. He heard about the exodus of Egypt, and he decides to bring himself and the family to the desert. And they come, and he sends a message to Moshe, "I'm here, your wife is here, your children are here." Moshe goes out to greet him. The whole nation goes out to greet him. And then the Torah describes a beautiful feast that they arranged, where Yisro was being fed and eating bread. And then the next day, of course, he starts mixing into his son-in-law's business, and he tells him he doesn't know how to run his operation. The next day, he sees Moshe sitting with the people from morning to evening, and he says, "It's not going to work. You're going to get ruined. Everybody's going to get ruined. Novel Tibel, you're going to decompose. This is impossible. You need to learn how to delegate." And he gives his son-in-law advice how to change, upend the entire system of operation. And the bigger chiddush is that Moshe actually listens to him. And the next scene is, he says goodbye to his father-in-law, and he sends him back home. He goes back home. Right away, the next scene is Matan Torah. On the third month, the first day of the month, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the Jewish people came to the desert of Sinai, and that's when the preparations for Matan Torah happened, until the revelation. And that goes to the second half of the parsha. And the question is, why do these two come together? It's a very interesting story. Yisro coming, giving advice, telling Moshe to do things differently, having a meal, bringing the family there. But why is that the first half of the parsha that deals with Matan Torah, which is really the central event of Jewish history, especially that Yisro himself wasn't a Jew. Yisro was a priest of Midian. In fact, Chazal say he was the greatest idolater. He knew that he was the greatest expert on idolatry in the world. And yet his arrival is the first half of the portion of Matan Torah. What's also interesting is the name of the parsha. It's Parshas Yisro. You would think that the portion of Matan Torah would have a more Jewish name or a Torah-dic name. Even if you want to give the name of a person, it would be maybe the name of Moshe. He's the one who received Torah. Or maybe the Parshas Matan Torah. Names in Yiddishkeit are very important. They capture the theme. And the name of this parsha is Yisro. He wasn't even a Jew, even though he was his father-in-law. And not only that, as he comes and he says to Moshe, "Ata yadati, now I know, ki gadol Hashem mikol elokim, Hashem is greater than all the gods." So Rashi brings from the Medrash, from the Mechilta, how did he know God is greater than all the gods? Malamed, shel hayniach avodah zarah shaloi avda. There was not a single idolatry that Yisro was not engaged in. So he knew literally, imagine the curiosity of this person, how inquisitive he was. Wherever there was a pagan form of worship, a philosophy, a religion, an idea, a practice, a form of worship, a cult, he went and investigated it. And he worshipped literally every single pagan avodah zarah that existed. So now he comes and say, Ata yadaiti, now I know, ki gadol Hashem mikol elokim, from all the gods. How did he know all the gods? He knew. So this is fascinating who this man was. Obviously he was a very curious person. He was a developed person. He was a great scholar and a great seeker. And now he says this, that God is greater than all of the other gods. And it's his name that the Parsha of Matan Torah carries, Parshas Yisro. Not Tzipora, not Gershon, not Eliezer, certainly not Moshe. What is the significance of that? In fact, the Zohar says, in the beginning of Parshas Yisro, that the Torah could not be given until Yisro arrived. So Yisro's arrival wasn't just a technical story, and even a beautiful story because the family came. But Yisro's arrival was not just a family event, it was a national event. The Zohar said only after Yisro could come, that's when Torah was given. In other words, till he arrived, there was something lacking, there was something missing. And the Zohar says, when he said, Ati Adati ki gadol Hashem mikol elokim, I know that God is greater than all the other gods. So now Yisro allowed Matan Torah to happen. Now the Torah could be revealed in the world. The question is why? It's a very nice thing that he came and he acknowledged and he said such beautiful things and he celebrated his son-in-law's accomplishment. That's all beautiful and astounding and heartwarming. But the Zohar says only afterwards Torah could be given. So we'll get back to this Be'ezer Hashem. But I want to now, it looks like we're going to change the subject. We're not really going to change the subject. But we'll get back to this at the end, Bli Neder. Let's see something very fascinating and also strange in the opening of the Ten Commandments, Aseres HaDibros. Everybody knows that the first words of the Aseres HaDibros is Anochi. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am God, your God. You have it here in the first source sheet. Yisro Perik Chaf Pasuk Aleph. That's Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. Vayidaber Elohim es kol advarim ha'ela lemer. Anochi Adonai Elohecha she'etzisichem eretz Mitzrayim beis avodim. Hashem spoke all of these words, saying, I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And that's the first one of the 10 sayings, the 10 commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your God, who took you out. And then comes the second one, you shouldn't have any other gods in my presence. And then comes the third and the fourth, all the way down to number 10. If we notice here, he identifies himself in 3 ways. Anochi, Hashem, Elokecha. Anochi we always translate as I am. I am Hashem Elokecha asher tzisichem eretz Mitzrayim beis avodim. Now usually in Chumash the word for I is Ani. Ani is I. Like we have even in Kriya Shema, the end of Kriya Shema, right? Ani Hashem Elokecha asher tzisichem eretz Mitzrayim. It's almost exactly the same words, but instead of using the word Anochi, the word is Ani. And usually whenever we want to say the word I, in Tanakh, the word is Ani, but here, the word is Anochi. So the Medrash says something very interesting about the word Anochi. If you take a look in your second source sheet, this is Medrash Tanchuma Baver, Parshas Yisro. Siman Tezayin, and it's also in Yalkut Shemaini, Parshas Shmos, Remez Reish Peivav. This is just the source where this Medrash comes from. Says the Medrash, Amar Reb Nechemia. Reb Nechemia says, Mahu Anochi. What is the meaning of the word Anochi? Loshen Mitzrihu. It's actually from the Egyptian language. It's not a Hebrew word. Adam shemavakesh loimer lachavere b'Mitzrayim ani hu oimer anoich or anoik. In Egypt, if you wanted to say I to somebody else, you wanted to tell your friend I, so the word you used was anoich or anoik. And therefore, the Tanchuma says, the Medrash says, that the word anoichi is Lashon Mitzri. It's not a Hebrew term. It's not from Lashon Kodesh. It's from the Egyptian language. Wow. I have to confess, when I saw this the first time, or when I saw it one of the times, I decided, even though I believe the Medrash, but I wanted to, it was strange to me that the word Anochi is not a Hebrew word, like, because, it's so entrenched in our culture, it's like really not a Hebrew word. So I went to, today it's not hard to do the research, so I went to do a little research. And indeed, if you look at the language of the Copts, that's C-O-P-T-S, which is representing the final stage of ancient Egyptian. Egypt went through many, many evolutions. And the final stage of ancient Egyptian language is called the Copts, C-O-P-T-S. It now survives only as a language that's used for liturgy, like for poems and songs in the Coptic church. That's where it survives, this language, but it's from ancient Egypt. So I was looking it up, and then I saw that the word anoich, or anoich, which is exactly how the word is spelled in the Medrash, means I. It literally means I. So this is actually in the ancient Egyptian language, that's how you say I. Anoich or anoich, and that's anoichi. So this is a very, very fascinating Medrash that Reb Nechemiah says. Hashem is basically saying, I am the God, your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, who took you out of the house of bondage. I took you out of that wretched, gloomy society where you were enslaved and subjugated, where your children were killed, where you were tortured, where you were slave laborers. And the opening word that he uses for this is an Egyptian word, anoichi. You just told me you took us out of Egypt. But it's interesting that the first word he actually uses, Beloshen Mitzri. And what is powerful is that this is the opening of the Aseres HaDibros. So the most central word that opens up the Ten Commandments is not a Hebrew word, it's an Egyptian word. Why is Hashem using an Egyptian pronoun to introduce himself at the most important moment of Jewish history, which actually talks about them being taken out of Egypt and the house of bondage? Now the truth is that it's not just the opening word of the Aseres HaDibros. In many ways it's the most quintessential, it's the most basic word of the Ten Commandments, because all the Ten Commandments and all of the Torah and mitzvahs are dependent on that single pronoun, anoichi. I am here. I am the one who did this. It's Hashem saying, this is me. I am behind all of this. I'm behind the Exodus of Egypt. I'm behind the universe, and I'm behind what's happening right here, right now. So in many ways you could say that the word anoichi is the most central and pivotal word in Torah, because all of the Aseres HaDibros are based on it, and all of Torah and mitzvahs are based on it. It's the axis upon which everything else revolves. It's the focal point of it all. And yet this essential pronoun, the beginning of all, Hashem introduces himself to the Jewish people in the world, giving them the entire Torah. He decided to use the Egyptian language, Anoichi Loshen Mitzri. Almost all the words in the Torah and all other words in the Aseres HaDibros are all in Hebrew. This is the language of the Torah. It's called Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. The Ramban says the language in which the world was also created. That's the language in which all of the Torah is written besides very few words. In contrast, the most central word of the Ten Commandments of the Torah, Anoichi, is communicated not in the organic language of Torah, but in the language that they just left, which is Egypt. And l'cha'ira, it's also not only not Hebrew, it's also the language that represented exile. So how are we supposed to understand this? So the Medrash continues and offers a very interesting explanation. If you take a look in your next source, Tanchum above again, Parshat Yisro, Siman Tazayno, Yalkut Shemaini, he gives us a whole explanation. And he says as follows. You have it also in the English, I have a translation. But I'll read it in the Hebrew and translate. B'shah sheba HaKadosh Baruch Hu litin Torah liYisrael, when Hashem came to give the Torah to the Jewish people, Diber imahem b'loshen shoyoydim u'mevinim. He wanted to speak to them in a language that they knew and understood. Anoichi Hashem Elokecha Amar Reb Nechemiah Ma'u Anoichi Loshen Mitzrihu. That's why Anoichi is Egyptian. And he explains. Adam shemavaker shleim lechaveda b'Mitzrayim ani u'emer Anoich. As we said before, in Egypt, if you want to say I, you say Anoich or Anoich. Lama davar doime, to what can this be compared? Lemelech shenishba b'noi. There was a king whose son was captured. V'asa yamim rabim im hashaboyim. And he spent many years with the captors, with the kidnappers. Lamad sichasam shel oisam hashaboyim. During those years, he learned the language of those captors because he was a hostage by them. Years pass, and the father takes vengeance of his enemies. He fights them, and he finally releases and liberates his child. And he wants to now converse with his child in his own native language. But the child doesn't know the language. He's been so many years alienated from his parents. Ma'asa. What should the parent do? So he began to speak to him in the language of his captors, so that he should be able to communicate, even though he was taking him away from there. And he wanted to speak to him and restore him back to his old life and their organic native language, but he couldn't understand a word that he's saying. So he spoke to him in this language. The same is true with Hashem and the Jewish people. During all those years that the Jewish people spent in Egypt, they learned the Egyptian speech, the Egyptian conversation language. Now when Hashem redeems them and wants to give them the Torah, they can't know how to hear it. They don't know how to understand it. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, Hareini meisiach imahem b'lashon Mitzri. You know what? I'm going to speak to them in the Egyptian language. Pasach va'amar anoichi. So the first word is anoichi, which is anoich, which is in Egyptian. So his first word is not in Hebrew. He wants them to understand when he says I, and that's why he converses in this language. That's what the Medrash is teaching us. Now, this is a very moving insight. The father doesn't want to wait till the child learns the language of the parent. Until then, they can't connect, they can't bond, they can't communicate. So therefore, he wants to communicate in a way that the child will understand, even though it's not his language, and in fact it may be a language that he detests or certainly has very, very profound negative feelings towards, because this is the language he was trying to liberate his child from. Nonetheless, I want to communicate with him or with her, and therefore he uses the word Anoichi Lashon Mitzri. That's what the Medrash is teaching us. It reminds us of the famous metaphor of Reb Nachman of Breslov. You know, the famous metaphor. He was the great, Reb Nachman of Breslov was the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, and he tells a story about the prince and the turkey. You remember the story? It's a very interesting story. There was a royal prince, like in this story, and unfortunately something overtook him, and he convinced himself that he was a turkey or he was a chicken. It came into his mind that he is a turkey. So what happens? He sits down beneath the table. He can't sit at a table. Turkeys don't sit at a table, at chairs. And he, of course, takes off his clothes, because turkeys don't wear clothes. And he's pecking at some bones or crumbs under the table. Of course, he stops speaking. All he can do is kukuriko. The king and the queen were horrified. They summoned every doctor, every psychologist, every expert in the kingdom, but nobody can help this boy. Nobody knows what to do. There was one sage who arrived and he volunteered to help. And he said that he will be able to help this child. And to everybody's astonishment, this man also removed all of his garments. And he also went down under the table. And he started to peck at the crumbs and at the bones. And suddenly the prince had company. There was another rooster together with him, also cooing together with him for days. And finally, he says to him, what are you doing here? He says, what are you doing here? He says, I'm a turkey. He says, I'm also a turkey. We could be friends. So they sat together for days and nights. And then, after a few days, the sage signaled to two servants to throw him 2 shirts. So they threw on the 2 shirts, and he puts on a shirt. And the other turkey looks at him and says, what are you doing? He says, who told you that turkeys don't wear shirts? Turkeys can also wear shirts. So he convinced him to put on a shirt. And then pants. He says, turkeys can also wear pants. So he convinced him to put on pants. And then, who told you that a turkey can't eat other foods? So he convinced him to start eating other foods. And then he sat at the table, and he convinced him that turkeys can also sit at a table. And so on and so forth, until until finally he was behaving like a human being. And Reb Nachman used to tell this story. He would tell a lot of stories, and you had to understand the metaphor. And the metaphor was that sometimes when you want to influence a person, I have to really go in to their mindset. I have to understand where they're coming from. I have to be able to make them believe that a turkey can also wear a shirt. If I tell them you're not a turkey, I become the enemy, I become the stranger. So it's really the ability to go into the other person's world, and it's not easy because I want them to come into my world. It takes a lot of humility, it takes a lot of courage, but this person understood that it's the only way that he's going to be able to really communicate from within, not be afraid of camouflaging himself as the identity of the turkey. And only then can I truly, truly influence the person. And the truth is that it's true in so many areas. You know, when I'm speaking to a person from a distance, emotionally or physically, it's not going to work. At least often it's not going to work, because that space inside of them that feels so distant won't be able to be moved. It won't be able to be touched. So there is an alienation that I have to get over, and that's a barrier. And that I can only do when I actually go into this place. So on one basic level, this is what the Medrash is telling us, that Hashem does exactly that, and he begins the Aseres HaDibros with the Egyptian language, like the child who does not understand the language, and I want to speak to you. There is, however, a great question, and that is, there's the famous Medrash that in Egypt, the Jewish people didn't change their language. Lo shinu es lashonom. It's one of the things that they did not change. They didn't change their names. They didn't change their language. And here suddenly the Medrash is telling us that they didn't know a word. They had to speak Anoichi. How does that stem? This seems like to be a contradiction. So you could say it's two different Medrashim. There's an argument. Another question would be, according to this, it's not just the first word that has to be Egyptian. All of the words have to be in Egypt. After the first word, he still doesn't know the message. You say, Anoichi, fine. So now I know I. It's hard to understand. All of the Aseres HaDibros should have been in Egyptian, not only the first word. Like the father, in the metaphor, the father speaks to the child in the language of the captors throughout the entire conversation, not just the first word. True, the first word is the most important. It's me, it's I, it's your father speaking to you. That's what he had to understand. But still, if you want him to understand the entire conversation, it would seem that the other words should also be in Egyptian. But the truth is that what the Medrash is telling us here goes one step deeper. It's not just a technical idea about the Egyptian language versus the Hebrew language. It could be that the Jewish people knew Lashon Kodesh, or at least many of them knew Hebrew, and because they still practiced their language even when they were in an ancient culture and an alien culture and slaves, as the other Medrash says. But rather, there is a deeper message here. And this has to do with the very nature of talking to the Jewish people at that time. It wasn't only about language, it was also about identity. And this is where the Medrash becomes so significant, not just in terms of linguistics, but also in terms of an existential relationship. And what we mean is, the Jewish people indeed left Egypt. That's true. But as we always talk about the fact, you could take somebody out of exile, you can't always take exile out of them. A part of Egypt, a part of Mitzrayim remained with them. And it remains within each of us. All of us, as we experience liberation on many levels, but there's still, as long as we live in this world and before there is a complete redemption in the world, there are parts of us that remain in Mitzrayim, or Mitzrayim remains in us. The word Mitzrayim comes from the word Meitzar, which means restrictions, confinements, limitations, fears, shells, husks that we live in. So we have parts, or our core, that remains wholesome, beautiful, idealistic, divine, perfect, glorious. But we also have parts that are insecure, that are fearful, that are gloomy, that are depressing, that are confining, that are very limiting. So there's a parts that make us feel and make us very restricted. We're very restricted, we're confined, we're limited. That's what Mitzrayim means. A person can get frustrated and angry and resentful and anxious and self-blaming and self-loathing, etc. Sad, whatever it is, every person's own Mitzrayim. And sometimes we carry in our psyche gallons of Mitzrayim, whatever that looks like, whether it's wounds or toxicity, guilt, sadness, fear, insecurity, and all types of various emotions and instincts. And this is where Anoichi Lashon Mitzri is so powerful. That the opening of Aseres HaDibros, the opening of Hashem's communication, the opening of the revelation, the opening of the giving of the Torah is with an Egyptian word. Not with a holy word, with an Egyptian word, Anoichi Lashon Mitzri. In other words, one of the greatest mistakes that a person could make is that we become fearful of our own Mitzrayim. It's almost feeling that God can't relate to that. He's not present there. There's no relationship with that. There's so much shame and guilt around it. So what the Medrash is telling us is, no, the opening of the Aseres HaDibros is Lashon Mitzri. I'm going to speak to you in the Egyptian language. I'm not afraid of that which torments you. I'm not afraid of that which makes you anxious. I'm not afraid of the darkness. It's only a klipa, it's a shell. And every shell is meant to pierce through it, to break through it, and to open up that which is inside of it. It's not like I cannot be found there, Hashem says. It's not like I can't relate to it. Within our Egyptian constructs and modalities and realities, there's nothing too scary or too overwhelming. When a person says, I'm just overwhelmed, I'm messed up, I'm ruined, I'm deteriorated, all of that, that's what Mitzri represents. That's what Mitzrayim represents. It's the house of bondage. It's the house of slavery. So the opening of the entire Aseres HaDibros is that word. The metaphor of the father speaking to the child in that language, it's not just about language, it's much deeper than that. The child may feel that there's no connection anymore because my conversation is completely different than your conversation. We don't even understand the same language. It's not just language. We don't understand the same terms. We're not living in the same paradigms. We see the world in completely different ways. There's language as language where you just translate, but then there's language as existence, language as a metaphor of concepts. It's a completely different language. It's not relatable to you. So the father comes and says, no, I'm going to speak this language. I'm not afraid of this language. We're going to connect right here in this language. In other words, from all the parts in yourself, you could connect. They're not alienated. They're not essentially foreign and remote. These are all things that can be elevated and sublimated and dealt with. So Anoichi, I, you're going to find in the Lashon Mitzri, even in the Egyptian words and modalities, inside of them you'll be able to find me, you'll be able to connect to me. And don't think that those parts of you have to be ignored or repressed or amputated or alienated, similar to what we spoke last week from the Baal Shem Tov, that Moshe told them at the sea, if you'll be able to look at Mitzrayim today, you won't have to see them again, or you won't never see them again in the same way. But if you don't have the courage to look at them, you're just going to ignore them. It's not like they're going to disappear. They're just going to become entrenched deeper and deeper and leak out in different ways. So here, even in a stronger way, the Aseres HaDibros actually begins with the word Anoichi Lashon Mitzri. So Hashem is telling his people, don't be afraid of your inner Egypt. Don't be afraid of your outer Egypt. In fact, the entire purpose of Torah is to communicate the divine message to that part of you, to the Lashon Mitzri. That is the purpose, to communicate the divine message into the Egyptian language, into the Egyptian space, to be able to embrace and communicate with my fragmented emotions and my challenging feelings and my broken thoughts and all of my toxic stuff that's going on, and share with them that God is here, that there is a God in the world. Share with them. Not be afraid that they are somehow out of the domain of holiness and there's no way I could communicate to them. And it means practically, sometimes different things come up in people's minds and people's hearts. There's moments where a person is elevated and inspired and overwhelmed by gratitude, and there's moments of ecstasy and clarity, and things are very, very clear. I'm not controlled by any klippas, by shells and husks. And those are very powerful moments. And then there's other moments where that gives room for an opposite experience, where the person is in a place of anxiety or duress and stress, where the person doesn't have clarity, where the person feels that part of their heart is shut down. They don't have clarity of what they want and who they really are. They feel like they're in a more external space. And it's not just intellectually, it's emotionally. The person's energy changes. that's exactly when I am in Mitzrayim. So the whole Yitzias Mitzrayim was, I'm coming in there to take you out. And the Aseres HaDibris, even when you're out from there, I'm going to speak to you that language. I'm not afraid of that language. In other words, we can hold on to that space. We can feel it. We can breathe through it. We can experience it and know that inside of there is Anochi, there's I. And because there's I, you can work through it. You can work through it and come out on the other side much more empowered, much stronger, much deeper, much more authentic, because now you have transformed and elevated and dealt with all the parts of your of your personality. So I don't have to get terrified or discouraged. I'm empowered to be with them and know that I can find meaning in them and throughout them, because it's the guilt and the shame around these feelings that drives people more mad than anything else. The experience itself is the experience. It's an invitation. It's something I need to work on. It's something I need to work through. It's also a divine message. Reb Nachman of Breslov writes in the Sefer Lekutei Maharan something very powerful. He says that it says in Parshas Yisro that Hashem tells Moshe, I'm going to come to you, Hine anochi bo elech, I'm going to come to you in the midst of the Anan and Arafel. I'm going to come to you in the midst of darkness and a heavy cloud. And that's what they see at Har Sinai. And he says what that means is that if you look into the darkness and the heavy cloud, you're going to find me, you're going to find Anochi. He says that's what Moshe understood. And that's Moshe's gift to the Jewish people. That don't be afraid of the clouds and the darkness, because inside, I'm over there, I'm going to be there. Just like the first word, Anochi, is Lashon Mitzri. Moshe is the clarity to know that inside there, work through it. Don't give up on yourself, and don't feel that this is the end and this just demonstrates that you're dishonest and everything is worthless and everything is futile, which happens, especially people who are working on themselves. You know, we don't stay in light for 24/7 until Mashiach comes. Very speedily in our days, hopefully today. But there's moments of light, there's moments of darkness. So he says, Hine anochi, I am going to be in that arafel, in that darkness. Moshe Rabbeinu understood that very well. And the Moshe and every Jew understands that very, very clearly. The challenge is that emotionally, when it happens, it doesn't feel that way. Because if it would feel that way, it wouldn't be dark. Right? It feels like I'm stuck. I'm in Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim literally means stuckness. Like literally a stuckness. It's a paralysis. It's an emotional stagnation. And so at that moment, it's just so easy to become blah, and like a numbness takes over. And you relate to what I'm talking about, yeah? Okay, some of you at least. Okay, like there's a little deadness that sets in. And that's literally like I'm again stuck in a gullus. Literally stuck in a gullus. And it takes then the awareness of Moshe Rabbeinu to say, no, I am there. I am in that darkness. I am in that cloud. So why do I have it? It's really because something that I need to work through. This is part of my growth, my healing process, my transformation. Everybody according to their own capacity. And it's literally designed. It's custom made for every person. In other words, different things will come up throughout the day, every single day, which is part of the neshama's journey that day. And every day is different. And sometimes when a person touches very high places, the darkness that comes afterwards could be more thick and more dense, because it's an opportunity actually to work through some deeper things that they're now ready for. So it's not something to discourage the person and disempower them and tell them that they were neglected, but on the contrary, it's my very mission. So Anochi Lashon Mitzri means that Hashem speaks to the Jewish people the first one and says, I'm about to give you Torah. I want you to know I'm not afraid of your Egypt. Your inner Egyptian qualities, you must not be afraid either. Speak to it. Just like I'm speaking to it. I'm speaking in it and I'm speaking to it. I'm not afraid to employ its language because I want to reach it. And therefore, you can also employ its language and reach it. It's like that prince, the sage goes down into that space. He's not afraid of that language. He knows that on the contrary, that's the only way he'll be able to lift him up. When I'm afraid of that language, a part of me could never be uplifted. That part always has to remain off limits. Only when I can go down under the table with myself. You know, think about that metaphor of Reb Nachman in terms of yourself. You know, we have inside of us a prince. We have inside of us a prince that sometimes thinks he's a turkey, right? It's a beautiful metaphor of Rabbi Yadin. I once read it, I think, in one of the books or articles of Rabbi Yadin, Even Yisrael, Rabbi Yadin Steinsaltz. It's a very, very powerful metaphor. He said there was once a huge storm, a thunderstorm. And you know, after these thunderstorms, unfortunately, a lot of the birds' nests get destroyed. The eggs don't survive, or the chicks don't survive. So there was this farmer who felt bad, and he started to look around after the thunderstorm for different nests. Maybe some eggs survived. And he saw that there was a nest of an eagle. And one egg seemed very much intact after the storm. And the farmer felt bad. He was a chicken farmer. So he took this egg and he brought it to the chicken coop. And one of the chickens, who didn't really know the difference, sat on this egg just as it sat on all of her other eggs. It usually takes 21 days, 3 weeks, for a chick to emerge from the egg. With an eagle, it's a little different, but the egg was warmed sufficiently. And one day, a little chick came out. Of course, only, nobody really knew the secret that this was an eagle. The mother, the chicken, thought it was one of her chicks. And what is even worse, the eagle himself thought that he was just another chicken or rooster. So he stayed with all of his siblings, pecking and looking for crumbs and bones and seeds. You know how chickens are. And he did this for years. And his head was all day in the ground, in the earth, like a chicken. And life went on. Anyway, he became an old man. And he already knew for years that he's a chicken. He looked a little different, but so what? People look different, in families, right? Not everybody looks mamish the same. Right? Nobody's perfect. So, he was a little different, but he was part of the family, and he was accepted as the family. And one day he was already an old man, and he was out there somewhere in the field looking for some bones or some crumbs or some bread or some seeds. And he lifted up his head for the first time. And he saw this most majestic, elegant eagle soaring. An eagle is, the king of the birds. And he gives a big krecht, he emits a big sigh. And he says, I wish I was an eagle. And that's the end of the story. Now, no chicken ever said that. No chicken picks up its head and says, I wish I was an eagle. And there's a reason no chicken says it, because they're not eagles, they're chickens. It was only he who is an eagle that can appreciate the pain and the angst. I wish I was an eagle, because he was an eagle. And he knew that he was not living up to his potential. But it's even deeper than this. What allowed him to be able to experience that? Not somebody coming into the farm and saying, you idiot, you're an eagle, not a chicken. But rather somebody modeling to him what an eagle looks like. When he could see what an eagle actually looks like, it's like, wow. Oh, and it reminded him of who he is, genetically. It was a memory of who he is. That's how you get reminded of who you are. If somebody would come into the farm and said, you think you're a chicken? You're worse than a chicken. At least chickens are chickens. You're a real idiot, because you're not even a chicken. You're an eagle and you're stuck here in slavery. And all that would do is, make him feel more guilty about himself and make sure that he doesn't leave ever. But it was the modeling, yeah. Yes. It's a very powerful metaphor on many layers. It's a very powerful metaphor. Because how common is this? How frequent is this? The egg just ends up in this place, and a person just doesn't know, this is my environment. And in each person's life, whatever that means. And sometimes my entire life, I'm trying desperately to fit in to be the chicken. And I'm trying to be good. But I see I'm a little different. I'm a little weird. I'm like, so how much shame and how much blame? And in so many people's lives, so much of my life is trying to fit in to a particular modality that works for other people, but it's really not a person's modality. I was giving a share the other day, so I gave a metaphor. I said, imagine you're stuck on the FDR, and there's a lot of traffic, and you're really trying to maneuver and get around, and somebody says, what are you doing here? You're actually in an airplane. You don't belong in the traffic of you're in an airplane. But they were told they just want to be like all the cars. So you got land in the FDR and you're struggling with traffic. Just rise up and fly, and there's no traffic over there. Air traffic is very different than Manhattan, George Washington, FDR traffic. I mean, sometimes you have air traffic, but it's a very different type of traffic. The world is open to you. But if I somehow learned that the way of being successful is if I'm in a car on the FDR, so that's my entire life. I'm trying to compete. I'm trying to compete with cars when I am an airplane. Now, how tragic is that? But in the person's mind, this is what success means. So it's really, truly appreciating and understanding that. But I can't understand it by somebody just telling it to me. But it's really an energetic experience of who the person really is. So Yitzias Mitzrayim doesn't mean Yeah. That I just become the eagle and I'm transformed into an eagle. It means that I have perspective, that I could look up and embody, feel what it means to be an eagle. And that's the moment, that's a great moment of grace. Now when I go back to my farm, because that's what I'm used to, I can hold that and I could communicate that truth even to the other parts that still feel that they have to be chickens. Now, we have nothing against chickens. Chickens are amazing and roosters are amazing. It's just if you're an eagle, you should be an eagle. You don't have to be a chicken. Yeah.
What about the role of either the eagle or the doctor? Like how far, like say the eagle didn't come down, the one that was flying didn't come down, but just the one that was on the floor, so the one that was up there. How far do you lower yourself as the mentor to the person who needs to be inspired without having yourself suffer?
That's a great question. That's a great question. In this story, the eagle didn't. In this story, the eagle didn't come down into the farm. In the other story, the sage went under the table. So that's a great question, and I think the answer is right there. If by flying over the chicken farm, I can inspire the chicken, that's good. But the sage knew if he's going to fly over the table, nobody's going to be inspired. He has to go down into that space. So we really have to make that very discerning call of how deep do I have to go down into the other person's space to be able to touch them. If I could just do it by flying over, that's amazing, but not always. Now, of course, you're right. Whenever a person goes into that space, they have to have the right gear. If the sage thought for a moment that by him going under the table, he's going to start thinking that he's a rooster, it would be very dangerous, because not only won't he help the rooster, he'll damage himself too. It's like a lifeguard. To jump into the water and schlep somebody out, you really have to know what you're doing. If I don't know how to swim, or even if I know how to swim, but I don't know how to schlep somebody who's struggling, we know what can happen, right? Chas v'shalom. So it's really the ability to be able to go down into those places must come with a person having the fortitude and the resilience and the internal safety and identity to be able to do it. I cannot hold space for other people if I don't know how to hold space for myself. It's impossible. Just like you can't have empathy for other people if you don't know how to have empathy for yourself, because all of that is going to come up. And if I don't have that empathy for myself, I'm going to get so triggered and entangled, and then I won't know what's me and what's the other person. So indeed, one needs to be very, very discerning, how they go down, when they go down, and not do it from a place of guilt or shame or desperation, but rather from a place of true love and affection and empathy. So there has to be a lot of an internal conversation. The Baal Shem Tov once said, it says in Chumash, "Hoicheach toichiach es amisecha." You should rebuke your friend, which is the mitzvah of basically trying to help somebody get out of a difficult situation or doing something wrong, etc. So the Baal Shem Tov says, why does it say twice? Hoicheach toichiach. And he says, because before you speak to the other person, you always have to first rebuke someone else. You have to first speak to yourself and ask yourself, where is this coming from? If this is coming from anger or desperation, or I'm overwhelmed or I'm stressed, or you're just triggering the living daylight out of me, then I'm usually not going to be effective. It's like the sage screaming, you idiot turkey, meshuggah of the bist, get out of the table. What happened to you? And then the turkey just says, oh, nobody gets me. Like, I can't trust anybody. So I first have to, before I speak to you, I first have to have a conversation with me and say, what is happening inside of me? What is happening? The more I could make space for my own Mitzrayim and deal with it, the more I could make space for another person's Mitzrayim and deal with it. So that's a very, very profound question of really understanding where the person is and how deeply I have to descend into their situation. But sometimes it's very, very deep. It's I got to go in to schlep him out. If somebody, God forbid, is in a pit, I have to go down. Sometimes I could just lower a rope. Sometimes they're too weak to take the rope. So it's the person, yeah?
There's also a point of jealousy, because the fact that the chicken looked up to the eagle and he saw part of him in the eagle, that means that so when we're jealous of someone, does that mean that we have a part of...
It's interesting what you're asking. It's interesting. I think The word jealousy usually has a very negative connotation, but not always. Like the Gemara says, kinas soifrim tar b'chachma, which means there's jealousy, like I'm jealous of you because I think you took it away from me. But then there's seeing something in you that speaks to me. It's an aspiration. It's aspirational, and that's a very powerful thing. When we see a quality in somebody and it speaks to us, it means somehow you're connecting to it. So now, learn from it. Maybe speak to the other person and ask them, what they did to get here. What are their methods? That's an amazing thing. It's an incredible, incredible thing. So it's a different type of jealousy. There's a jealousy where I'm busy obsessing with you having something, feeling that you stole it from me. And that only means that I don't know who I am. I'm not looking inside, and I don't even know my power. And I think you took it from me. It would be like the ray of the sun getting jealous of another ray. Like, why are you shining in that house? Like it's my. And the answer is the sun has enough rays for everybody. Trust me, you don't need to. The other ray did not steal your thunder, your light, I should say. The other ray did not steal your light. The sun has enough light for everybody to go around. You can ask the other ray, wow, you are amazing. Teach me. There was a Jew I knew. His name was Reb Mendel Futterfass, Reb Menachem Mendel Futterfass. So he was in Stalin's gulag for I think more than 10 years in Siberia, and he survived. He was a very, very intelligent man, a very funny person. So when he got out of Russia after many, many years, he liked telling stories of his experience. And when you spend 10 years in Siberia, trust me, you got lots of stories. So he once shared an amazing story. It was such a lesson. He would tell the yeshiva bachim stories. He once shared an incredible story. He said that they used to play cards in the barracks at night. There was nothing to do. He himself didn't play, but they would play cards. Now, it was illegal. You weren't allowed to play cards. And if you were caught with cards, you could be put in solitary confinement or punished terribly. This is Siberia, where most people didn't survive. You remember, you're talking about 70 below zero. In the winter, it could be 70 below zero. It's crazy. So he says, but in his barrack, there was this group, and they always played cards, and the warden never caught them. He never caught them. Anyway, once the nachalnik in Russian is like the prison warden, comes in, he comes to their barrack, they're playing cards, and they hear the footsteps, and suddenly all the cards disappear. They go into somebody's hand, and then he comes in and he says, I know you're playing cards, and I'm going to find them. And he searches everywhere for the cards, everywhere. And there weren't really beds, but there was like, straws, mats of straw. There were no drawers or lockers. This is Siberia. This old barracks it was not livable. It was horrible. So there was not much to search, not much place to search, but he searched everywhere. He could not find the cards. He's angry. He's cursing in real Russian curses that I'm not going to repeat here. And they know how to do it. Yeah, much better than the Americans. And he said, I'm still going to catch you guys. I'm going to catch you. And he leaves in anger and he slams the door. And Reb Mendel says, and 5 seconds later, the cards come out. And he cannot understand this. So the next day he goes over to one of the leaders there. It was a big Russian muscular fellow. And he says, you have to tell me the mystery. How do you guys do this? So he says, listen, you I trust. I'm going to tell you the story. But if you share this story with even one person, I will kill you with my bare hands. So Reb Mendel didn't share it in Siberia, but after he came to America, he shared the story. And the man says as follows, we have here the best pickpocketer of Moscow. The best pickpocketer of Moscow. So this is what happens. When the guy comes in, we hear him coming, we collect the cards, we give it to this guy, he's always near the door. And when the inspector comes in, he slips the cards into the pocket of the inspector. The inspector looks everywhere. The only place he doesn't think to look is in his own pocket. When he's about to leave, he takes out the cards from his pocket. He leaves with the spirit. So the Mendel said, he turned to the yeshiva brachim, he says, everybody's looking for the cards in everybody else's pocket. They don't know that it's in their own pocket. I'm searching here and there, it's in your pocket, your drawer, your bank, your house, your marriage, your kids. It's in your own pocket. The guy never thought in a million years to check there. How would the cards come into his pocket? And then Mendel said he learned so much about life at that moment. And that's really what it's about. The moment a person can truly realize that. Somebody told me sometimes there's a person people love spending time with. And the reason they love spending time with is because, the person has such a purity or such a wisdom or such idealism or such regulation that it's really inspiring. And one of the mistakes we could make is that we attribute power to that person, and then it becomes about jealousy. You know, I want to be you. But it's not what that person is. That person is just in the frequency of God's light. You know, it's like if I tell somebody I want to look at you because you're the sunlight. You're not the sunlight. You're in the sunlight. So you're reflecting the sunlight. So it's amazing. So the job is now you come into the sunlight, so you'll also reflect the sunlight. So relationships are very, very blessed and powerful when they can teach us how we can have access to the sunlight. When it becomes about, I want your position in the sunlight, that something is off. Something is off because that's where loy sachmai, that's where the 10th commandment comes in, right? That's where jealousy comes in the sense that I feel that you stole my thunder. You stole my light. You didn't steal my light. Nobody could steal anybody's light. We can learn from each other how to channel that sunlight, how to stand in the sunlight. So that's also that's the idea of the eagle of the real chicken is never jealous of an eagle. It's not supposed to be an eagle. I don't see the deer in my backyard in Muncie ever get jealous of squirrels, and squirrels ever get jealous of deer, and bears get jealous. It's only people who have big imaginations, and we start comparing ourselves. So the reason the eagle got so jealous is because it was an eagle. It was looking at something it was supposed to be. And whenever there's something I'm supposed to be and I'm not, there's a pain, there's an angst. And that's why people have such deep idealistic aspirations, and it gets them upset, but it shouldn't get you upset. What you're searching for is to touch yourself, to touch your sunlight. And if another person can help me see that, that's amazing. So in that sense, that anoichi loshen mitzri, so back to the medrash. So when Hashem comes and says, I want to speak to you in the Egyptian language, like the father to the child who is in captivity, I'm not afraid of the language. Again, we're not only talking about language here, we're talking about emotional language. You know, those words that seem so debilitating, so difficult, I can't even utter them. Like, can I speak to Hashem in that language? Can He speak to me in that language? And the answer is exactly. That's exactly the whole purpose of the reason the Torah was given. It wasn't given in heaven to the angels. It was given to the people who were in Egypt. The Gemara says in Shabbos that when Moshe came to get the Torah, the angels said it doesn't belong on earth, it belongs in heaven. And Hashem told Moshe, give them an answer. And he said, have you been in Egypt? They said, no. So he said, well, the whole Torah begins, if you haven't been in Egypt, then the whole Torah wasn't given. It's exactly to communicate the language to the rooster who's under the table and doesn't think capable of being above the table and having that level of communication with that space without the fear and the paralysis that these parts in me are just too ugly, too undesirable, too grotesque, too weird to be able to deal with. Did I answer your question? Very important, yeah. Very important. You know the story of Reb Meir of Primishlan? It's a beautiful story. There was a Jew that came to Reb Meir of Primishlan, and he said that somebody else took his parnasa away from him. He took his livelihood away from him. So he told him, I guess it wasn't so realistic. So he told him that he said, did you ever notice that when a horse comes to a pond to drink, you ever see what a horse does before it drinks? To a trough, to a pond, to an ocean, it starts kicking. It kicks the water very strongly, and then it drinks. Why? So he said, because when the horse comes to drink, suddenly in the water it sees a horse. So it thinks there's another horse coming to steal my water. So what does the horse do? He starts kicking the horse in the water until the water becomes dirty and murky with mud, and then the other horse is gone. And then he says, now it's my water, now I can start drinking. So Meir Primishlan says, what the horse doesn't realize is that what he was seeing is his own reflection. He wasn't seeing another horse. And by kicking it, he just made his water dirty. And he also forgot that God has enough water for all the horses. So this is so true in life. You know, I think by making my water dirty, now suddenly it's going to become my water. So Reb Meir said, don't try to be not like that horse. So here the point really is that when we can model that for other people, it becomes a very, 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 very powerful tool for that healing. Now here, we come to another very important point, and that is the name of Anoichi. The name that's used here is Anoichi. What does Anoichi mean? Anoichi, of course, means I in the Egyptian language. As I said, Hashem identifies himself here in 3 words. Anoichi, Hashem, Elokecha, which is usually translated, I am the Lord, your God. The last 2 are in Hebrew. Hashem, Elokecha are Hebrew words. The first one is in Egyptian. Now let's understand this. Hashem has names. Names means the way he's known and experienced by others. Like you'll say, you have a good name, you have a good reputation. This is your name, this is how people call you. So a name represents how other people know you, how other people relate to you, how other people experience. You know, people have a nickname, people have a cute name, people have different names. But then there's Anoichi. What's Anoichi? Anoichi is not a name. Anoichi is the very I, the essence of everything. It's I, it's not even a name. So a name is something that's relatable to others. I is literally your quintessence, right? Your name and reputation represent that which people know about you. You'll say, she has a great name, right? He has an interesting name. He has a good name. But there is your innermost I, which nobody knows. Sometimes you don't even know it. If I asked you, what does your essence mamish look like? Maybe some of us have a little glimpse of our essence. Sometimes we ourselves don't have a name for our essence because it's beyond names. That's what Anoichi is. Anoichi is the essence. So how do we touch the Anoichi? How do we touch the Anoichi of Hashem? The innermost essence of Hashem. Hashem's essence beyond all names, beyond all experiences, beyond all light, beyond any definition and description we could relate to. Here comes the true depth of the Medrash. It's not through spiritual segregation. It's through Lashon Mitzri. The Anoichi we touch through Lashon Mitzri, by having the courage to bring the divine light into our inner and outer Egypt. The Anoichi is Mitzri. Hashem Elokecha is in Hebrew. Sometimes it's counterintuitive and it's paradoxical, but it's the raw truth. When I face my Mitzri, when I face all of my struggles, my pain, my temptations, my brokenness, whatever they look like, when I don't run from them, when I don't get afraid of them, I rather embrace them and I choose to find the infinite light inside all of these parts of my life. I don't touch God's names. I don't touch Hashem's names or spiritual light. Rather, you capture the I of Hashem, the essence of Hashem, his very Anoichi, the deepest and purest essence, the ultimate core of all reality. So Hashem is teaching the Jewish people something very profound. The eye of Anoichi, the eye of Hashem himself, you can only grab onto if you're ready to go down into Lashon Mitzri, into Egypt, into the psychology and environment of the Egypt inside of you, and bring light and clarity and holiness and morality and values and authenticity and truth and godliness into those seemingly very lowly, dark, or even depraved spaces. That's what Shlomo HaMelech says when he builds the Beis HaMikdash. If you look in the last source, Malachim Aleph, Ches, Chav Zayin, Shlomo builds the Beis HaMikdash and he says these words: Ki ha'umnam yeshev elehim ala haaretz, hine hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim lo yechalkeluch, avke habayis hazeh asher banisi. Can God really dwell on the earth? The heavens and the heavens of heavens can't contain you. Yes, this temple that I have erected will contain you? Shlomo HaMelech is astounded. The highest heavens can't be a keli, lo yechal kalucha, they can't contain you. And here's a little simple home on the Temple Mount on Har HaBayis that's going to contain you. What is Shlomo HaMelech really saying? The heavens, shamayim, ushmei hashamayim, the heavens of heavens, representing deep, spiritual, lofty aspirations and states of consciousness. Heaven is not just physical heaven, it's the heaven in the person. It's when a person reaches heaven. They cannot contain you. Lo yechal kalucha, they can't contain you. They can perhaps capture some of your names, some of your revelation, some of your radiation, some of your brightness, some of your luminescence, but not you. It's this home which I erected right here from physical bricks. You could go to the excavations near the Kaisel and see, literally from physical bricks, physical matter, with physical blood and sweat and tears and physical people, amidst all types of obstacles and confusions. It's this home, a home built from physical matter. This is the home which contains you, Anoichi, your deepest core. And if you see, his word is Af ki habayis hazeh asher banisi. And one of the interpretations here is the word af means, you know what the word af? Af means anger and pain, like v'chara af Hashem b'chem. This is a home built from af. It's a home built from moments of brokenness, from moments of pain. Af. This bias is built from af. This can actually contain you. This is what contains you. So Anoichi Loshin Mitzri. It's in the Mitzri. The Anoichi is ready to come down to Mitzri. He's not afraid. And now it's also the opposite way we're learning. It's from the Mitzri that you touch the Anoichi. Therefore, not only should you not be afraid of it, but on the contrary, this is the greatest opportunity to touch the real essence that's beyond light. And the reason it touches the essence beyond light is because it looks so dark. So the light doesn't reach it, but the essence reaches it. Because the essence is not afraid of darkness. The essence is present in the arafel and the chayshech as much as it's in the light. So paradoxically, by touching those places in myself and yourself, you go not to the names. You don't go to Hashem Elokecha, you go to the Anoichi that precedes all of it. And it's true about ourselves, it's also true about others. Sometimes we're bashful to reach certain people. We're bashful to reach out to certain people, to connect to certain individuals, to make an impact on surroundings. We're like, that's Mitzri. That's like too far, it's too remote. How can I bring godliness, holiness, love, Yiddishkeit, truth, authenticity? These people are too alien or too triggering or it's too far. But what we're learning here is Anoichi Lashon Mitzri. The entire function and purpose of Torah was Hashem said, I wanted to be brought down to Lashon Mitzri, to enlighten, educate, and transform narrow-mindedness and the restrictions of Egypt into an oasis for the divine. Don't give up on any person, not on yourself, not on your child, not on your friend's child, and not on any Jew or any other person. Because never be afraid to go down to those places in yourself and others. It's in the Lashon Mitzri that Anoichi comes down to, and that's where you find something even deeper than all the names. That's where you find the true essence. Yeah, you can ask. Yeah.
When I hear Anochi, I think that ego, or like a lot of funny stuff
Yeah.
that happen. So just to clarify, is it that Anochi already in the creation is in our ego, and we're kind of sifting through it to find it, to get us out of it, or we're given like a mission to bring down the Anochi of Hashem in order to help figure out.
Great question. So the answer is, the real Anoichi is the opposite of ego. Right? Just like we spoke before about jealousy. Anoichi means I. The truest I of a person is one with Hashem's Anoichi. It's really one. And therefore, that truest I is present in every part of our life. Your I is present in all your names. It's present by day, it's present by night, it's present in our highs, it's present in our lows. That Anoichi, that essence, is present in every moment and in every experience. So when we could relate to that Anoichi, which is really Hashem's Anoichi, because of the oneness, so then we're not afraid of going into all the other parts of ourselves, because the essence is already there. And like you say, I just have to reveal it, even though it sometimes takes a lot of work. And precisely by going down to those places in myself, I will find my essence that's much deeper than my name. You sometimes see it also in a person. I mean, I think you can always see it. When do people touch their deepest essence? When do you get to know yourself in the most profound way? Not just your name, you know. There's 3 parts to every person, it says in Medrash. There's who I am, there's who I think I am, and there's who you think I am. How many people make peace between all these 3? There's who you are, there's who you think you are, there's who other people think you are. That's the difference of Anoichi, Hashem, Elokecha. Anoichi is who you are. Hashem, Yudke Vavke, is already a name, but it's the essential name. It's who you think you are. And Elokecha, which is the only name of Hashem that changes between the plural and the individual, Elokecha, Elokechem, Eloka, Elokai, is the only name of Hashem that adjusts according to the individual nature, is who other people think you are. So there is my name for myself, who I think I am, how I experience myself, which is much deeper. And then there's who I really am, and then there's who other people think I am, which is the part of me that relates to them. In life, our purpose is to make peace between all these 3. It takes a lot of courage. First of all, you have to find out who you are. And second of all, you have to not care so much about what other people think you are. So to all these 3 come together, right? That's Anoichi Hashem Elokecha. Where do we really get in touch with our Anoichi? It's usually when we sift through and we touch our scariest places, our darkest places. The places that trigger you most. Like Reb Nachman says, I said earlier, I am going to be in that darkness. It's usually when I have the courage to go to those places that I'll be able to find my deepest secrets, my deepest essence. As long as I'm not ready to touch that, at best I will relate to some of my names, which means I'll relate to external parts of me. But it's that anoichi, that essence of essence, which is beyond names, beyond description. You can't even talk about it because you can't define it. It's just like an inner frequency. It's an inner divine frequency and flow. It's the anoichi, it's the I that's beyond anything. And that I usually touch when I'm ready to sift through and work through the Mitzrayim inside of me. So that anoichi is always present. So now we come back to Yisro. So this is the secret of Yisro coming before Matan Torah. Who is Yisro? Yisro was not Jewish. In fact, Yisro worshipped every Avodah Zarah in the world. Comes the Zohar and says the Torah can't be given until Yisro comes and says, Ati Yadati Ki Gadol Hashem Mikol Ha'elikim. Because this is exactly what Yisro gave the Jewish people. Yisro represented somebody from a completely different world. We spoke before about Anoichi Loshen Mitzri. The first word of Aseres Hadibris is an Egyptian word. It's not a Hebrew word. And Yisro, for whom the Parsha is named, represents somebody who's from a completely different culture and a different world, Kayan Midyan. And then he comes into the Midbar. So the Zohar says now when he comes, the Torah can be given because Yisro represents the paradigm of elevating and sublimating everything in the world to Hashem. Yisro represents the idea that even a person like me, and not only even, precisely a person like me, when he says, Ati Yadati Ki Gadol Hashem Mikol Ha'elikim, now I know that God is greater than all the gods, he gave the Jewish people the confidence to be able to know that don't be afraid even of a Yisro who worshipped every single Avodah Zarah in the world, because when you have the truth, you don't be afraid not of the Yisro inside of you, not of the Yisro outside of you. On the contrary, this gave the Jewish people a confidence and a trajectory and a purpose that could only come from Yisro, because he literally came from all the chachmais. He learned all of the wisdom, and then he brought it all back. So now he articulated that the ultimate power of Matan Torah is to elevate and sublimate every single part of ourselves, including the lowest part of ourselves, like Yisro, who worships every Avodah Zarah, and yet ultimately says, from it and through it, Ati Yadati Gadol Hashem Mikol Ha'elikim. Now, not everybody has to go through what Yisro went through. That's not the mitzvah to go through what Yisro. But Yisro represented that paradigm that ultimately everything in the world and every experience in life can bring you to ultimately figure out Ati Yadati Gadol Hashem Mikol Ha'elikim. And it's also practically because the Jewish people were slaves for so many years. And slaves stop having confidence. The Even Ezra says that at Kriyas Yamsov they were so afraid of the Egyptians, even though you had 600,000 men between 20 and 60. So fight them. And the Even Ezra says they couldn't because they saw their masters. And a slave psychologically is subservient to the masters. They didn't have the courage to fight them. That's what Even Ezra says. They were so many years slaves. Psychologically, they were looking at their masters, even though they outnumbered them, but emotionally, they didn't have the guts, the courage, the audacity to fight them. That's why they were so paralyzed. That's what Even Ezra writes. So now they're coming to Mount Sinai just 7 weeks after they're liberated, and God says, I carried you out on the wings of eagles. You're not chickens, you're eagles. Literally, that's what he says in Yisro. And I'm going to make you Mamleches Kayanim V'Goy Kadosh, a holy nation. And you're going to transform the whole world. And the Jews like, we? You got the wrong people here. Well, not me. You got the wrong people. To give them something so powerful like Torah and give them this mission that's so powerful, it was very difficult. You know, just like we can't contain deep sadness, it's also hard to contain deep joy. Like sometimes the news is too big to contain. And it was Yisro who suddenly comes into their life and says, I have been there on the other side. I could tell you about the product you have. Ata Yadati Ki Gadol Hashem Mikol Ha'elikim. Yisro empowered them in an entirely new way. Yisro showed them what they have, and when they heard it from Yisro, they can listen to it because Yisro came from a completely different place. And Yisro also showed them what the purpose is. Anoichi Loshen Mitzri. The purpose is to be able to permeate the entire world and the entire world of a person with the truth of Torah, not be afraid of any of it, because even Yisro, every klipa that he went through brought him back ultimately to God, because now he could say, Dati Gadol Hashem Mikol Ha'elikim. And Yisro also taught them something powerful. You know, often people make mistakes in life. Yisro worshipped every Avodah Zarah, but at this moment, everything was sublimated in a very interesting way, because he realized that every Avodah Zarah that he worshipped could teach him Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol elokim. He could have never said that God is greater than every other God if there was one avodah zarah that he didn't touch. So this means paradoxically and counterintuitively, every avodah zarah that he fell into, which was avodah zarah, was paganism, at this moment becomes transformed because it gives him the awareness that he could have never had without it. Like the Gemara says that when we do tshuva out of love, every sin becomes a mitzvah. So Yitro was teaching the Jewish people as well, that when we go through our stumbling blocks and failures, every one becomes a stepping stone and a catalyst to be able to say, Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol elokim. This klipa, this shell, this husk, everyone just teaches me more and more and more the truth of Hashem, the truth of Ein Od Milvado. And that by going through it, it like becomes a stepping stone, it becomes a catalyst, it becomes a springboard. And that's why the name is actually Yisro, because Parshat Yisro represents that the ultimate purpose is a Noichi Lashon Mitzri. It's not just Yiddishkeit will remain in its own bubble. Ultimately, the entire world, like we say in Aleinu, L'saken Olam b'malchus Shin Daled Yud, the entire world is going to be transformed. I don't want to compare one person to another person, but I'll just say this, and it may be interesting to note, and that is last week, President Trump met the Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and he threw a bombshell as he said that America is going to take over Gaza, and send 1.7 million Arabs who live there to another country where they could live safely, and he's going to renovate it and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. Okay. So, Hasidim have good jokes. So one guy told me this is really an invitation for all the Satmar Hasidim to be able to move to Eretz Yisrael into Gaza, because it's going to be under American occupation. So that's how Mashiach will get all of Satmar to move into Eretz Yisrael without any issues whatsoever. Okay, that was just a funny joke that a Satmar Hasid gave me. It is. I was there. It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. Yeah, I was in Gush Katif, yeah. Now, I know that President Trump has a Jewish son-in-law. Nonetheless, I don't mean to compare him to Yisro and his son-in-law to Moshe Rabbeinu, with all due respect to him and his wonderful son-in-law. But nonetheless, sometimes you could see something and learn something very powerful. When Yisro comes to the Jewish people and he speaks to them, it makes an impact that is extremely powerful because he comes from such a different world, from such a different culture. And he gave them a boost that they should have had, but because of their situation, they didn't have it. And hearing from Yisro these words, it empowered them, it uplifted them. Yisro said, the grass is greener on the other side. I went to all the green grass on all the other sides. I've been there, done it, I went through it, I experimented with it, and I'm coming here and I'm telling you, Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol elokim. This is your opportunity for ultimate transformation of yourself and the entire world. It was a fascinating moment. As Trump said this, there was a woman, I saw the video, who sprung up and said, but it's their home. How can you do this? This is their home. And he looked at her and he said, a home? I'm not going to use the word he said, but he said it's a Gehenna, basically. He said it a little more graphic. So it's a crazy place. Every house is attached to another bomb. Every few years is another war. For 100 years, been trying to do the same thing. You got to think out of the box. You got to think differently. It's simply not working. It's not working to rebuild it billions of dollars, so they should declare another war in a few years, chas v'shalom, against the Jewish people. So somebody said, yeah, but it's their home. You're occupying somebody else's home. What about a Palestinian state? Just build a Palestinian state in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of space there for a Palestinian state. And I found it fascinating because here comes an American president who's not Jewish in the first weeks of his presidency, and he's not ashamed to tell the whole world that the old strategy of doing things the same way again and again is going to fail. And essentially, all of Eretz Yisrael is God's eternal gift to the Jewish people for eternity, and you don't have to be embarrassed about it. And it's the only way to make peace, not just for the Jews, but also for the Arabs. So this was a fascinating thing where Jews were embarrassed to say for decades because they have to be politically correct. Here comes a man, and it's not even his country, he's an American. And he has the guts to say this about Gaza and Jews. It is their country. God gave it to them. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov walked there 3,700 years ago, 2,000 years before Muhammad was born. David HaMelech walked there, and Shmuel HaNavi walked there, and Shaul HaMelech walked there, and Shlomo HaMelech walked there. You're talking about 3,000 years ago, 3,200 years ago, 3,400 years ago, 3,600 years ago. We're always embarrassed to talk this way. And the shame to talk this way allowed us to fall into a trap of absolute absurdity, of giving territory and building up a people that simply has one agenda, and that is to murder literally every single Jew. So sometimes it's a Yisro that teaches people how to speak, how to be confident. And everybody screams for a few days, and then they scratch their head and they say, not a bad idea. Not such a bad idea. But the real challenge is that Jews liberate themselves from their own inferiority complex, and from their own fears, and from their own negative self-image, and really have the pride and the dignity to be able to speak the truth to the whole world. And this is a tremendous opportune time. So here we have a living example of how sometimes the statements of a non-Jew can empower a nation to be able to think differently and change its strategy, to be able to embrace its true ethic of life and love and peace. Have a beautiful week. Thank you. Next week we're on 9:30 next Tuesday, Be'ezer Hashem. You're welcome. Oh, wow. Wow, okay, amazing. Thank you for coming. Ah, beautiful. JLI,
The only thing I was going to say is, those three people, what you think of me, what I think of myself, and what else I think of
yeah.
you, because we really
No, there's who you are, there's who you think you are, and there's other people think you are.
So you know your demons and who you are and all
Yeah.
that, right? So it's very hard. That it's because you care what you think other people think of you, that imposter syndrome, that makes it really hard to find out who you really are, because you're like,
Yes,
those two
yeah.
things are so different.
That's true.
Yeah.
When I really start believing I'm a chicken.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of atzlacha.
Today.